The days are getting shorter, the leaves are changing, and there's a bit of a chill in the air. You might even say the season is a bit spooky. And that means it's time to mull some cider, queue up a few seasons of Buffy, and put the 3D printed knitting machine to work. Let's knit some tall, stripy socks. If you watched my last video, you might have heard me say really, really tall socks and thought, but Sparks, you already have a circular sock machine. If you wanted longer socks, couldn't you just knit them on that? But, more? Well, here's the issue. I have itty-bitty feet, but the legs of a lifelong pedestrian. My foot circumference is way smaller than the measurement around my calves, and if I want to go above the knees, we're talking about more than double my usual ankle sock stitch count. This isn't just a me problem, to be fair. Generally speaking, human legs aren't actually column-shaped. Off-the-rack hosiery often attempts to address this dilemma by using very stretchy synthetic materials, but even then I have a hard time getting a good fit. Sock machine patterns sometimes recommend manipulating the tension to adjust circumferences along the length of the leg, which could probably buy me an inch or two, but maybe not like 7 or 8. What I really need to bridge these discrepancies is some pretty aggressive increasing and decreasing of the stitch count. But you can't really change the stitch count on a circular machine without either skipping needles, which affects the texture and tension in those areas, or changing cylinders, which is not really a quick and convenient swap in my experience. The good news is that this type of shaping is pretty easy to do when knitting on a flat machine, and this is actually kind of what the first knitting machines, stocking frames, were invented for. You definitely can knit a whole sock or stocking entirely flat, including the foot, and seam it up either as you go or after the whole thing is knitted. But for this project, I'm going to try to take advantage of the best of both worlds. I'll knit the leg portion flat and seam it up the back into a tube, then transfer that tube over to the circular machine for a seamless foot. And you might note that I said try here. What you're about to see is actually my first attempt at this design, and to be honest, it doesn't always go as smoothly as I'd hoped. I'll try to point out where things go off track, how I recovered, and what I'd do differently next time, but keep in mind that this is definitely more of a loose demo than a precise follow-along tutorial. So, here's the plan, such as it is. It's going to be over the knee, knit top down, with a folded hem, fully fashioned shaping through the leg, thick stripes, a contrast heel, toe, and cuff, and joined with a cable panel at the back. I'll be knitting to my own measurements rather than a formal pattern, but luckily I do have some code hanging around from when I knit a similar style before. This sketch was not actually meant to be a pattern generator per se. It was more about visualizing the shape and counting the resulting stitches so that I could do some art with it, but more on that another time. But it does have most of the key stitch and row counts, so at least I don't have to do all the math completely from scratch. I did change a few design features though, like all the color changes for the stripes and adding a wider back panel join instead of a simple seam, so I ended up doing some recalculation to make sure I got the shaping even and hit my target stitch count. My circular machine has a 54 needle cylinder installed, so no matter what else I do with the rest of the leg, I need to end up with 54 live stitches to transfer. My back seam will be 4 stitches wide, so the ankle of my main panel should be the remaining 50 stitches, plus 2 selvage stitches that will get used in the seam, so my target is 52 stitches. The rest of the leg shaping is going to be based on my leg measurements and the gauge numbers I get from my tension swatches, also taking into account that whole plus minus 2 stitches thing for the back panel join. I'm knitting with Drops Fable, a light fingering weight sock yarn in gray and black for the stripes, plus this pop of color for the contrast heel, toe, and cuff. The mix of green and orange with specks of red reminded me of the changing autumn leaves. I don't have a yarn mast set up for the flatbed machine yet, so I won't be winding these onto cones just yet, but I do want to rewind them into nicer center pull balls. I don't actually own a ball winder though, so I grabbed an empty paper roll and put in some elbow grease. Since I'm aiming for a close, contoured fit, It's crucial to knit some tension swatches for this project to get a good idea of my gauge to make sure the math checks out. And of course, since I'll be switching from one machine to another, I'm also aiming to get a reasonably similar gauge on both the machines. I'll be demonstrating this on my 3D printed knitting machine with the Mark II carriage, so I'm going to make a note of a few things that are a bit specific to this machine, but I expect most of the flat knitting techniques I'm going to show in this project should translate pretty well to other single bed machines. The first quirk about this machine is that the bed is in multiple pieces that slot together, and you can extend or shorten it to adapt to your needs. Each of my needle bed units has 25 needles, and my maximum stitch count for this project is 116, so I'm going to set up 5 of these units for a total of 125 needles across the bed. I like to place a non-slip drawer liner under my needle bed before clamping it down to help keep everything secure. Since my last video, I've experimented with borrowing the digital row counter from my circular sock machine. I taped the magnet to the back of the carriage and secured the wand to a spare section of prototype needle bed so it's at the correct height. And I adjusted the gap until I get a good consistent reading when the carriage passes. While it's not the most elegant setup, I think it's been working pretty well for me, so I'll definitely think about a more user-friendly assembly to add to the project when it's released. Some knitting machines out there are perfectly happy for you to cast on without any weights attached, and then attach claw or comb weights to the first row. But this machine is not really in that club. I always set up a pre-made cast-on rag with existing loops or rings to knit into, similar to how I cast onto the CSM, so I can add weight before the cast-on row. I don't have a precise ratio of rings to needles in this case, so I'm just trying to distribute them so the weight will hang evenly. If you have proper knitting machine weights, you can go ahead and hang those on your cast-on rags. I don't, so I use these metal mending plates from the hardware store, which slip easily into the hem pocket of my cast-on rags. After hanging the weights, I load up some scrap yarn, securing the tail, and slowly move the carriage across. If anything gets stuck, I don't panic or try to force the carriage through the jam. I might be able to peek under the yarn feeder to spot the problem and try to correct it, but if not, I can easily lift the carriage off the bed and inspect what went wrong, starting again if needed. I continued knitting a few rows of scrap yarn until it felt well established, and then it's time to start the project yarn. I didn't bother to use a row of ravel cord in between this time, but you certainly could add it here, and I kind of wish I had. I added my contrast color project yarn, leaving a modest tail, and knit 20 rows. I then picked up the starting row for a folded hem, realized this was way too narrow, undid all my stitch hanging, reset the row counter, and knit 20 more rows. Then I hung the hem. This is pretty much the same as hanging the hem on the sock machine, but you'll end up with one less bump to hang than your number of active stitches. Here I switched to the black yarn for my first stripe. I'll be changing stripe colors every 10 rows, so whenever my row counter ends in 0, but working my decreases every 3 rows until I reach the knee. This was a lot to keep track of, but I did kind of get into the rhythm after a while. My first couple of color changes between the stripes, I realized I didn't have a good plan for handling the non-working color yarn. I'd have preferred not to deal with a bunch of loose cut ends, but my brain was just a little too fuzzy to puzzle out how to carry the vertical floats for such a wide stripe. I resigned myself to weaving in all those ends later, but almost immediately realized that having all those loose ends on the same side of the work was going to lead to a pretty sloppy selvage, and thus a really bad time when I had to join those edges later. I switched to weaving in the ends as I went, securing the new tail before starting the color change and the old tail after. I think this did help keep things a bit tidier, but in the future I'll definitely practice some ways of carrying the inactive strand without cutting it. My shaping is worked by moving the 3 stitches at each edge, moving in to overlap a single needle when decreasing, or moving out and lifting a stitch to fill the empty needle when increasing. I don't have any multi-pronged transfer tools, so I'm moving each stitch individually. It's a bit slower, but it does still get the job done. After a few sparse increases below the knee, I started decreasing again for the calf, this time working my shaping every 4 rows, so it's a bit more gradual. About midway through the shaping, I decided to count my remaining needles and make some temporary marks to indicate when I would reach the target number of stitches for the ankle, so I didn't have to stop and keep counting. I used a dry erase whiteboard marker and it wiped off no problem for me, but if you try this, I definitely recommend testing in an inconspicuous place first to make sure it doesn't stain your machine. Out. Snip that. Hang a little clip. Done with that for now. Every other needle is wrapped behind the latches, and add a clip over here. Slide those back to knit. Other color one. Here, put those together. Push it back. After working my final shaping row, I worked one last color change and a couple of rows of that stripe, then several rows of scrap yarn, including fixing a drop stitch, and then removed the work from the machine. Before I can finish the foot, I need to join the leg into a tube. For a while now, I'd had my eye on a really lovely cable technique demonstrated by Diana Sullivan, and this seemed like a great excuse to use it. Now, Diana's tutorial is really good, and I am about to do it an utterly abominable disservice, so I'm not going to describe all the details here. Please just promise me you will go check out her video to see how this was supposed to turn out in my mind's eye. But alas, it did not occur to me to, practice this technique before trying it on an active project on camera, and I upped the difficulty level by using black yarn on a black needle bed with tiny little stitches and very awkward video lighting. So I got very frustrated, ripped out my work several times, considered giving up knitting forever, and eventually negotiated myself down to just giving up the cable twist for now. So what I ended up with is a chunky, kinda wobbly stripe. My original plan was to knit this back seam section in black, but at the last minute I thought it would be cute to use the contrast yarn. In the end, I don't really love it. It might have worked a bit better if I'd pulled off the cable texture as planned, but overall I think it's just a bit flashier than I wanted and kind of, spoils the element of surprise when you get a peek at the other contrast sections. Anyway, when I had finally joined all the way to the ankle, I secured those last 4 live stitches onto bobby pins, which seemed a bit easier to wrangle than scrap yarn for such a small section, and I moved over to the circular machine to knit the foot. All right, so I'm gonna set this up on the circular sock machine, but I realized that I have made a couple of miscalculations or nothing that I can't recover from, but I realized I was gonna leave the strand attached, but that's not gonna work because this is my center back, but I actually need I need to start work on this at the side where so that I have the cylinder set up in the correct orientation to do the heel. And the other problem with this is that I have an even number of stitches in this green accent, but I have an uneven number of stitches in
my heel target section. So it's going to be slightly off center, and I think what I'm going to do is for the second sock in the pair, I'll just make sure that I off center it in the opposite direction, so then at least they still are mirrored, even if they're not perfectly centered over the heel. It's all gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. And the other thing that I need to figure out that I didn't really plan for is that I need to extend this gray. I should have knit a few more rows of this gray on the flat machine so that I could seam them with this contrasting yarn, because that's going to be a little bit tougher to do on the circular machine. So I might have to fake it a little bit once I get this off. I think I'm just gonna knit with the rest of the stripe in the gray, and then I might come along and like do the duplicate stitch or put a little something there to kind of disguise the fact that I don't have this continuous color going all the way into the heel. It always surprises me a little bit how much planning is required for for knitting on the machine. It always takes me a little bit by surprise. So yeah, lessons are being learned, but that's okay. And I'm gonna go ahead and pop this on. This is actually the first time I'm doing this, so it's a bit nerve-wracking to do it on camera, but I'm gonna have to do a little bit of counting and get the live stitches hung. It's too early in the morning and I haven't had enough tea. All right, let me think this through. I'll be right back.
I took a few minutes here to cone up my yarn and finally managed to bang together enough brain cells to attempt rehanging my work. So I had pretty optimistically said I'd be showing you my first time, but apparently I got everything hung, knit a whole stripe, and then, for reasons that are an absolute mystery to me now, I removed everything and started over again. So this is me rehanging, I guess. I started with the back seam, which is the most obvious landmark, and worked my way around the back half of the cylinder. Then put those needles into hold positions so I could hang the other half of the stitches. I often hesitate to put needles in hold more than I absolutely have to on this machine because it's a bit of a pain to return the needles to work, but in this case it seemed really worth it to get all the stitches secure and line everything up the way I wanted before adding the working yarn. So with everything secure, I finished my gray stripe, knit half of a black stripe, and then set up for the heel. So from this point, knitting the heel, knitting the whole rest of the foot really, is almost exactly the same process as what I did in my first sock machine video. The main difference is that I have to change colors a few times, so I do need to keep a closer eye on both the row counter and the cylinder markings to make sure the color changes happen where I want them. I decided to use the clasped loop or faux Russian join technique to join new yarns again, since it's fast and keeps all the ends secure. Keep in mind though that it's not the most precise way to change colors. To change from my contrast heel, I looped in the green yarn after raising the instep needles, but before finishing the heel half of this round, so that the new yarn is securely worked in before raising my first needle to short row in. After working all my heel shaping, I should have done the same thing and looped in my new color halfway through this final row, but I kind of lost track of this amidst all the needle management and I knit too far. If I had kept going here, I would have ended up with a weird and pretty obvious stripe of green across the instep, so I had to do quite a bit of fiddling to unknit those last few stitches. Again, the hold position really saved the day here. At long last, I could crank somewhat freely through the foot, but of course I still had to keep an eye on the row count for color changes. I tried to place these changes on the bottom of the foot where they would be a little bit less obvious, but otherwise I wasn't too precious about getting them all lined up. I got about halfway through my toe shaping when I realized that my short rows were lopsided. I had missed raising a needle on one side somewhere along the way, but I couldn't spot where. After a half-hearted attempt to fix things in place, I realized I'd be better off just removing it from the machine and rehanging at a point before the toe. I'm not gonna lie, this setback after so many nearly broke my spirit, but after a bit of a wallow and a decent night's sleep, I decided that I wasn't going to succumb to despair when stubbornness and spite were available instead. Since I was undoing things anyway, I realized that this weensy little single row of black stripe wasn't doing me any favors, and unlike the heel, there's no reason not to start the toe color a round or two early, since it'll be grafted together anyway. So I rehung the gray stripe and replaced that final color change by knitting an extra round of the contrast. Finally, I can scrap off. There's a toe to be grafted and ends to be woven in, and of course, there's a whole other sock to be knit with the lessons learned from this one. But until next time, stay spooky.